Joining me now, Senator Mazie Hirono of Hawaii. She's a member of the Senate Judiciary and Armed Services Committees, and last year she reintroduced the Protecting and Preserving Social Security Act. Senator Hirono, great to see you. Welcome to the Sunday Show.
Good to be with you, Jonathan.
So how seriously should we take the GOP about doing away with or tinkering with Social Security?
We should take it very seriously because they actually put it out there, as you say, Rick Scott, Florida, where they have a lot of seniors on Social Security. He put it out there. Remember, he is the guy who headed up their Senate reelection program. So it's not just one senator. It's the guy who headed up their program. We should take it very seriously because this is part of their plan, the Republican plan to cut government spending.
Mm-hmm. And so what, if anything, can Democrats do to stop this from happening?
Oh, we can certainly talk about it. And I was so delighted when the president said, some of you would like to do this, and then to see them skittering around trying to get away from it. No, the fact that they are fighting among themselves says that this is a serious issue for the Republicans. And well, it should be, because there are millions of people relying on Social Security.
Were you surprised, as you were there?
Yes.
Were you surprised as I was, that the Republicans walked right into a trap set by the president on Social Security?
Well, they put it out there last year, so they should have expected that the president would put it right out there, and he did. So this is a plan that they proposed last year. Mm-hmm. Why would they think that we wouldn't continue to hang it around their necks?
Last year, the Republican Study Committee in the House, endorsed by more than 180 members, put out an official budget proposal that would raise the retirement age to 70. Mm-hmm. Now Republicans are trying to tie all those things to the raising of the debt ceiling. Should entitlement reform be a part of that discussion of raising the debt ceiling?
Of course not, because the debt ceiling is about paying the bills. The stuff that we've already bought, we should pay for, and that is the debt ceiling. But the Republicans like to take issues such as Social Security and other issues, cutting government as a part of the hostage taking on the debt ceiling. So if they want to talk about the budget, et cetera, we should start with, how about making sure that the richest people in the country that the Republicans helped to the tune of almost $1.9 trillion in tax cuts? Why don't we start with talking about making sure those folks pay their fair share of taxes?
So speaking of the budget, as Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, pointed out when she was here earlier in the show, the president's budget will be released on March 9th. Mm-hmm. Thus will begin the opening bid of negotiations on the budget. Mm-hmm. Again, when that happens, shouldn't there be a discussion about ways to make Social Security and Medicare more solvent, more funding?
Well, thank you for mentioning in the beginning that I have a bill that would do that for Social Security. What my bill would do is it would lift the income ceiling for payments into the Social Security Trust Fund. And that ceiling right now is $160,000, and anybody making over that doesn't pay a single dime more into Social Security, and that should not be how it works. Everybody should be paying into Social Security Trust Fund. My bill would do that. It will extend that trust fund until 2052. So that is one of the ways that we're going to strengthen Social Security.
So I just want to make sure, because actually there's a question I was going to ask Maya in the next interview. Right now, just the first $160,200 of wages are subject to the 6.2% tax. And if I heard you right, you think there should be no income limit.
Well, my bill would phase in that income limit. In my opinion, there shouldn't be any income limit at all. Because Social Security is relied upon by millions and millions of people, including close to 300,000 in the state of Hawaii alone. And that money should be there. And we all should be paying into it, and that's it, as far as I'm concerned. But tell that to the Republicans as they try to run away from their desire to cut programs that really support working people and retirees. They care about the richest people in our country, that is for sure, but not about the working people and the retirees that we Democrats care about.
Senator Mazie Hirono of the great state of Hawaii, thank you very much for coming in.
Delighted to be here.
The Sunday Show.
Aloha, everybody.
Aloha. Joining me now, Maya McGinnis, president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Maya, thank you very much for coming back to the Sunday show. So, first question, important question, is Social Security really dying? Is it going to be insolvent in the next 12 years?
Dying, no. The program's still going to be there and it's still going to work. But absolutely, the trust funds are facing insolvency. And so the first point of the discussion has to be kind of a realistic framing, which is we do have to make changes to Social Security. There should be zero debate about the fact that changes have to be made. When today's 55-year-olds are hitting retirement age, the program is not going to have enough money to pay full benefits. If we do nothing, there will be across the board 20% or more benefit cuts for everyone, down to the poorest widow who depends on the program for all of her retirement benefits. So that's not a good option. So there should be no disagreement. We have to make changes to Social Security. Where there's plenty of legitimate disagreement is what should we do to make the program solvent again? And you're just talking about one option with the senator. There are a number of different ways, and that's where I think the real fight should be. Not we're going to do nothing, which just means across the board benefit cuts, but what should we do? How should we make it solvent?
Okay, so then let's talk about Senator Hirono's proposal, which is to raise or eliminate the first $160,200 of wages being subject to the 6.2 Social Security tax. What do you think of her proposal?
Yeah, I think the proposal to lift the payroll tax cap makes an awful lot of sense. Right now it's capped, and there's a lot of money that could go in to fund the program and extend the life of it. It would not achieve solvency. It would get you about 2/3 of the way there. There are two problems I would just put out. I do think that it's a sensible policy, but one, the president has promised not to raise taxes on people below $400,000. So if you go ahead and only lift that cap over $400,000, you're losing a lot of the revenues. I think you'd lose probably half the revenues in the first decade. So that suddenly brings way down the improvements you could make. And the second is just a broader question, Jonathan, that I think we need to talk about. And it's what are the national priorities that you want to fund? So if we raise revenues and we put them all into Social Security, that's going to make all of the benefits closer to whole, closer to what we've promised. That makes a lot of sense looking forward. But if you look at the broader budgetary picture, and we don't do that very often because Congress rarely passes budgets, but if you do, keep in mind facts like we spend $6 per senior on every one we spend for children. So we definitely need more revenues. We need them to fund important investments. We need them to bring our debt down. But I think we should actually have a national debate about what the most important priorities are. Are they making sure that Bill Gates gets all of his benefits as promised? Or might some of the new revenues go to other pressing needs like investing in human capital or younger kids? I would just say we need to have that debate before we put all the money that we could raise into Social Security without considering all the different priorities.
One thing I noticed you didn't mention in the minute that we have left is raising the retirement age. What's wrong with raising the retirement age up a couple years or 3 or 5, especially when folks like me in our 50s, you know, we still got a good, 40, 50 years in us, maybe.
No, that's right. So lifting the payroll tax doesn't fix the entire program. I think we need to put everything on the table. I do think we need to look at raising the retirement age. When Social Security began, retirement age was 65. Life expectancy was 62. These things have changed. So gradually phasing in an older retirement age for people who can work, not people who are doing back-breaking work, but people who can work longer, they really should. I also think we should look at slowing the growth of benefits for people on the upper income. A progressive change to it is looking at how we don't give as large benefits to the people who are making the most money as retirees. Retirees, as a cohort, are one of the richest cohorts there are in the country. So scaling back benefits for people who don't need them makes sense. Here's the problem. We waited so long. The hole is so deep. We're going to have to make a little bit of all of these changes. So what I would urge Congress, I know everybody, the State of the Union was very clever. Frankly, it looked a bit like an AARP pep rally with them all cheering there for Social Security and Medicare. But we have to talk about how to fix the program. And if we wait another decade, those choices are going to be many fewer and it's going to be more painful.